Hey, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving into the incredibly complex world of wound care. With a ton of different products out there, how do you even begin to know which one is the right one? Well, it turns out that picking the correct dressing is one of the biggest factors in healing faster and better, and we're here to make that whole choice a lot clearer for you. So, to really get why this matters so much, just take a look at this number. On any given day, in Australia alone, about 500,000 people are walking around with a wound that just won't heal. That is a massive number of people whose entire quality of life really depends on how well their wounds are being managed. And that really brings us to the big question for this entire explainer. The sheer number of options can be totally overwhelming. And, that often leads to confusion and sometimes even using the wrong product. So, how do you match the right dressing to the right wound? That's exactly what we're about to break down. And don't worry, we've got a roadmap. First, we're going to make things way simpler by sorting all dressings into two main families. Then, we'll look at dressings that manage moisture, the ones that act like protective shields, and of course, the heavy hitters that fight off infection. And at the end, we'll pull it all together so you can see exactly how this works in the real world. All right, let's start by cutting through some of the noise. The very first step is understanding this really fundamental split in the world of wound dressings. If you can get this one decision right, I promise, everything else becomes so much easier to understand. So it turns out, pretty much every wound dressing out there falls into one of two main camps. They're either inert and passive, or they are interactive and bioactive. Getting a handle on this one distinction is really the foundation for all of modern wound care. So what's the real difference here? Well, it's a completely different way of thinking. On the left, you have the old school inert dressings, like basic gauze. They're passive. They kind of just sit there and cover the wound. But on the right, that's where modern care is at. These are interactive dressings. They are designed to actively change the wound environment, maybe by soaking up fluid, donating moisture, or fighting microbes, all to create the absolute perfect conditions for the body to heal itself. Okay, so let's build on that idea. The most common job for an interactive dressing is managing moisture, what doctors and nurses call exudate. See, wounds are rarely just right. They're almost always either too wet or too dry, and that creates two very different jobs for dressing. Either it needs to absorb a bunch of fluid, or it needs to donate moisture back in. Now, before we get into the actual products, we have to talk about this key term, autolytic debridement. I know, it sounds super complicated, but it's really just the body's natural cleanup process. It uses its own little enzymes to break down and get rid of dead tissue. The magic of a lot of these modern dressings is that they create the perfect moist environment to basically put that natural process into overdrive. First up, we have hydrocolloids. These are fantastic for clean wounds that don't have a ton of fluid. They soak up a little moisture and form this gel, which keeps the wound bed nice and moist and, you guessed it, directly promotes that autolytic debridement we just talked about. But definitely pay attention to the precautions. They're not for wounds that are draining a lot or for diabetic foot ulcers. So, what about wounds that are producing a lot more fluid? Well, that's when you call in the workhorses, foam dressings. Their whole purpose in life is absorption. They are perfect for wounds with moderate to heavy drainage because they pull that extra moisture away while also giving the area a bit of protective cushioning. The key thing to remember, never ever put a foam dressing on a dry wound. It'll just make it even drier. Now here's a more specialized kind of absorber. Alginates. These are often made from seaweed, believe it or not, and they are incredibly absorbent. But what makes them really unique, as you can see under uses, is that they can come in a rope form. This makes them perfect for packing into deeper wounds or cavities. Some of them even have what's called hemostatic properties, which is just a fancy way of saying they can help stop minor bleeding. Okay, let's totally flip the script. We've been talking about absorbing moisture, but what if a wound is too dry? That's where the hydrators come in. Hydrogels are mostly water, just in a gel form, and their job is to donate moisture back to a dry wound. This not only feels really good and can relieve pain, but it's also essential for softening up hard, dead tissue so the body can do its cleanup job. All right, so managing moisture is huge, but it's not the whole story. Sometimes the main goal isn't absorbing or hydrating. It's simply protecting delicate new tissue or the fragile skin around a wound. For that, we turn to the protective shields. Tolly dressings are a classic example of this. They act as this fine, non-stick mesh layer right against the wound. But what's really cool is seeing how they've evolved. The development of silicone Tollies has been a massive game changer, especially for people with fragile skin, like a lot of older adults. These soft silicone layers mean you can change the dressing without hurting the new healing tissue underneath.
Film dressings are kind of like a second skin. They're these super thin, transparent sheets that create a barrier that's waterproof and keeps bacteria out, but, and this is the cool part, they're still breathable so water vapor can escape. And that transparency is a huge plus because it means you can actually see the wound and check on it without having to take the dressing off.
Next up are non-adherent dressings, and you've probably seen these before. They're often used as that first layer right on top of a superficial wound to make sure nothing sticks. The more advanced ones actually have highly absorbent materials built in, making them great as a secondary dressing to help manage more fluid.
Okay, let's move on to a really critical category. What happens when a wound is already infected or is at a really high risk of getting infected? Well, just absorbing fluid or protecting it isn't enough anymore. It's time to call in the infection fighters.
The main job of an antimicrobial dressing is to reduce what's called the bioburden. That's the clinical way of saying the total amount of bacteria and other germs living in the wound. When that bioburden gets too high, it stalls healing and can quickly lead to a serious infection. One of the oldest and still one of the most powerful antimicrobials out there is iodine. Modern dressings are really clever. They're designed to release it slowly and steadily into the wound. And it is effective against a huge range of microbes. We're talking bacteria, fungi, and viruses. This makes it an amazing choice for infected wounds, though it's usually recommended for shorter-term use. The other major player in the infection-fighting game is silver. Just like iodine, it's a broad-spectrum antimicrobial. What makes silver so useful is that it often gets combined with other types of dressings, so you can get a silver foam or a silver alginate, which gives you both antimicrobial action and fluid absorption in one. But check out that precaution, it's a big one. If you don't see any improvement after 2 weeks, it's time to stop and rethink the whole plan. Wow, we have covered a lot of ground, right? From absorbers and hydrators to shields and fighters. So now, let's actually put this into practice. We'll run through a couple of quick scenarios to see how all this knowledge actually leads you to the right choice. Okay, let's take our first case, a venous leg ulcer. What's one of the main things we know about these? They tend to produce a lot of fluid, or exudate. So the key feature here is heavy drainage. The right dressing class, then, it's got to be something from that high absorption family, like a foam or an alginate, to handle all that moisture. You can see that direct line from the wound's behavior straight to the dressing's function. Now, for the complete opposite situation, imagine a wound that's covered in dry, hard, dead tissue, what we call necrotic tissue. Well, the key feature here isn't getting rid of moisture, it's adding it. The wound needs rehydration so the body can clean it up. So the logical choice is a hydrating dressing, like a hydrogel, to give that essential moisture back to the wound. And we're going to end on this one absolutely crucial takeaway. A dressing is an amazing tool. It can absorb, it can hydrate, it can protect, it can fight infection, but it only ever manages the wound environment. It doesn't fix the underlying cause of the wound, whether that's bad circulation or too much pressure. Real wound care means using the right dressing as just one piece of a much larger plan to treat the whole person. So that leaves us with a final thought. What do you think is the biggest challenge in wound care today? Thanks for watching.